One more thing, folks, and then we'll get started, okay? I just forgot my Kuzari. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started now. And I hope everyone is doing well. We had an absence of just one Tuesday, as it turned out, because the trip that we made was on a Tuesday evening, and we finished it on a Sunday night. So all worked out for the purposes of this year. I hope I want to wish everyone a happy Hanukkah, Chanukah Sameach. And Bezrat Hashem, we should all be in Eretz Yisrael next year, being able to celebrate in the place where the miracle took place and where so many miracles have taken place subsequently. We are in the Kuzari, and what we are doing is we're on page 4, bottom of page 407. Really, we're really on the bottom of page 408. And what we were discussing the last few weeks is the whole idea that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi presents to us about human perception. Now, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is talking about human perception is that our vocabulary, the very language that we use to interface and to express ourselves, to express our ideas, is based on our perception of reality. We are limited by our perceptions of reality in order to be able to articulate what ideas are circulating in our minds. If we perceive reality in a limited way, then our vocabulary, our language is limited to the way that we perceive things. Are we clear on that? Does that follow? In other words, your imagination can imagine things that are perhaps different from reality, but are still subsumed under certain principles. I can't think of, for example, a situation that is timeless because I live in a time-bound reality. I can't think of the lack of space because I live in a space-bound reality. No matter how much I'd like to be able to conceptualize things that are beyond the framework of the time-space, or space-time, which is what the term is, in the modern science, space-time is what they refer to the limitations of our reality. I can't even think of things, my mind doesn't compute things that exist outside of space-time. And so my language is perforce going to be subjugated to that space-time reality. So I have things in my vocabulary, such as before and after, bigger, smaller, that are terms that only apply within space-time. If I was to try and say that Hashem is really great, I might want to say that he's the biggest, but that would be a false description of God, because God is neither big nor small. This is something that the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi both pick up on. When we say that Hashem is Kel Chai, right, that he is the living God. If you recall, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had discussed this previously. He had said that we don't mean that God is a living being, because to say that God is alive is limiting of God. because God is beyond life and death. All we mean to say is that God is an active God as much as someone who is alive in our perception of reality is active, right? Or we mean to say, like in the language of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, that he's not dead, right? That he's not a dormant God, okay? But terms that we use to describe Hashem are perforce limited, just like anything that we describe is in terms of our own reality, not in a reality that transcends what we perceive. So this conversation assumes that which isn't necessarily assumed by all thinkers in today's world. There are some, I think they call them rationalist, I forget what the whole term is, rationalist scientists who basically say that because there is a lack of evidence that anything exists beyond space-time, we can safely assume that that is the totality of reality. That is not the view of our tradition. The view of our tradition is that it would be naive for a person to assume that all that exists is that which we perceive sensually with our senses. In reality, there's much more that exists outside of that which we perceive. Okay, that's what we've been discussing up until now. And the reason why Rabbi Yehuda Levi felt that this was a relevant discussion is because we're talking about how we describe God in our vocabulary. And we were specifically talking about the shame that we say Adonai. It is the name that we ascribe to God based upon our limited understanding of Hashem as he manifests himself in this world. And that's in contrast to the four-letter name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the Shem, what we call the Shem Havaya or the Tetragrammaton, which is a name that is more descriptive of Hashem, but which is not only ineffable, but imperceptible. And we only have it as a tradition based on the way Hashem appeared before certain Nevi'im, certain prophets. Okay? We just visited in our trip, we visited a Muslim country. Their name for God is Allah, because that corresponds to Elohim, right? Because that's the perceptible God. That's the God that is knowable to human beings. The Shem Havaya is not a name, it's not a descriptive name that is knowable to human beings, but we use it because it was given to our Nevi'im, and we therefore use it as a borrowed term. When, therefore, a person thinks about the letters of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, they're not expected to have any other higher understanding of what that name imparts, other than it's a mysterious name. It's a name that transcends the human mind's ability to process. Yeah, there is actually no name Yud. You only find it in the Sidur as an abbreviation for the Shem Havaya. But that was a convention that was chosen by publishers sometime in the Middle Ages. But you won't find that, let's say, in Tanakh. You won't find in the Torah or Tanakh that name Yud. That's only, yeah, right. Okay, Linda, yes, please go ahead.
Hold on. Hi, good morning. So my question is really, why do we have to know God by different names? Why do we even have to have different names for God? Why can't we just know God as God? I mean, wouldn't that be more accessible to us rather than, all these different names that are supposed to mean different things?
Valid question. So what do you think is the reason why this is an important thing for us to endeavor?
Well, it sounds like it's because we want the different names will make us approach God in a different way by each name when we read it, like the perception and how we should perceive him at that point in time, sort of more respectful, more in awe, things like that. But I mean, I think that shouldn't we always maintain that same feeling of awe or fear or holiness or whatever it is you want to describe in those different situations? Shouldn't we always maintain those same attitudes regardless of what we call him?
Well, maybe yes and maybe no. Michelle says each name denotes a different energy. Well, that's sort of like a Kabbalistic kind of or mysterious kind of language. And I would agree that in a sense, all we can know really of Hashem is how he chooses to manifest himself to us. And the reason why this is important is because God seeks man. What's that name? What's Heschel's book? God in Search of Man. God is seeking out man to have a relationship with man. And the way that we know that God is seeking us out is because he manifests himself to us and identifies himself to our prophets and says, this is how I would like to be known. In other words, each name that Hashem has presented us with gives us an additional insight into the specific interface that God is utilizing at any given place and situation. And that allows the human beings to be able to relate in some way, on some level, to a completely transcendent being. If God wanted to be completely transcendent and not have man relate to him, then God would have used only one name. Each name allows the human being to have some level of interface. It's almost like the interface of a computer or of any kind of that the word interface is something that I think is very apt, as we use that to describe the way a computer system is accessible to human beings. If it used to be in the old days that if you needed to get something from a computer, you needed to know machine code, and you'd have to generate punch cards and push them into the machine and be able to, and only computer programmers were able to do that. Nowadays, we have a much more accessible interface that allows us to, the brains and guts of computers haven't changed essentially. It's still the idea of storage of knowledge using zeros and ones. But now the interface has become more sophisticated that even someone who's not does not know machine code or assembly code has the ability to interface with that same computer, maybe a more sophisticated computer system, but nonetheless, the idea remains the same. It's the creation of that interface that Hashem wishes to have with us. Okay, and that's the reason why we have so many different ways of knowing Hashem, is because in different situations, there are different interfaces with Hashem. Sometimes it's a stern God, sometimes it's a happy God, sometimes it's a loving God, sometimes it's an angry God, etc., etc. Okay, now the last thing, so that's the last thing that we saw. It brings us to bottom of page 408, and
You froze. You froze. Oh boy.
let's say, like this scientist, Donald Hoffman, that I've been talking about a lot, like he says, let's say I were to tell you that there really is no physical reality. And when you feel yourself putting one foot in front of the other, that's not really your feet. There's no ground there. It's all an artificial construct. But it's still helpful to perceive the reality as feet walking on ground, because that way you know that if you come to a ledge or a cliff, you know that to stop at the ledge before walking off the ledge. Because whatever the reality is, by walking off the ledge or walking into traffic, let's say, it may not really be a truck that hits you, but it certainly is going to have the effect of how your senses perceive a truck hitting bone and flesh. Okay, so whatever that reality is, it may be a flawed representation of reality, but it still has utility. It's still helpful. And that's the point that Rabbi Yehuda Levi makes in the bottom paragraph on page 408. He says, let me illustrate this. A person with understanding who has excellent vision and is searching for his lost camel can benefit from a person who is bleary-eyed and squints. We had read this paragraph quickly last time. Because of that other person's impaired vision, that person sees everything double. Nevertheless, when he says, I saw two cranes, I saw two large birds in such and such a place, the person of keen sight will know that he saw his camel. He will understand that this fellow sees everything double, and that because of his poor vision, he mistook a camel for a crane, and that because of his bleary-eyed state, he saw it in duplicate. The person with excellent vision therefore benefits from this man's testimony. He gives him the benefit of the doubt, attributing his poor report to his poor vision. In the same way, one's senses and perceptive abilities relate to the intellect. Okay? So that's the idea that I want to leave us with for today, which is that even though we acknowledge that our perception is not reality, we respect our perception. We know that it's helpful to us. We know that it helps save us from harm. It helps bring things that are beneficial for us, and brings us closer to those things that are beneficial to us. And we know that if, for whatever reason, our senses were to be impaired, it would only make it that much harder for us to flourish and survive. So we're grateful for our senses, but at the same time, because they have utility for our survival, but at the same time, we acknowledge that our senses do not bring to us that which is representative of true reality. And that, in relating that to Hashem's name, which is what he's going to get into eventually, and that human beings have a relationship with the external reality through our senses. That's the only way that we can relate to external reality, is through our senses. Now, Hashem made us the way he made us because he wants us to understand reality in that way, but he doesn't, at least according to the Kabbalistic tradition, he doesn't want us to be limited by that perception alone. Once we've mastered our senses and we use our senses correctly and appropriately, we then have to appreciate that there is far more to reality that transcends what our senses bring to us. Okay? I think I'm just rehashing at this point. So why don't we go on? We'll hold it here for today as far as the Kuzari. What to me is uncanny is how modern science is now coming to that realization that was part of a mystical tradition, literally centuries and centuries ago. Okay, now scientists are actually starting to realize this theory, the truth of this theory, based on scientific speculation and not just on a mystical tradition. I can't even present to you the proofs that are being presented in the laboratory, but it seems like, based on evolutionary science, that this is the case. And knowing that we have a limited understanding of reality or perception of reality would also help us appreciate that once we get into realms that are smaller than what our world perception perceives, we start to see inconsistencies that cannot be reconciled by science. Why? Because those inconsistencies, let's say, for the real issue that has plagued scientists for close to a century now is the inconsistency in theories between relativity and quantum physics. What some scientists are now suggesting is that this inconsistency will never be reconciled. simply because the inconsistency in physics only exists on the subatomic level. And that was not part of that realm was never meant to be perceived by the human being with his senses alone. And since we don't perceive those realities with our senses alone, even when we magnify things and we use experimentation to prove certain theorems about the subatomic realm, we see all kinds of strange things happening simply because our perceived reality starts to unravel once we get into the subatomic realm. Okay, I'm gonna hold it there. Okay, let me bring up our screen for Parshas Miketz. I don't know if that was helpful to anybody other than myself. I apologize if it was a little bit too esoteric. What? You thought it was helpful? Okay, good. I appreciate that. Okay. Parshat Miketz, Shabbos Chanukah. Okay. One of the most tragic psukim in all of the Torah is what I want to focus on today. Vayar Yosef et echav vayakirem. Yosef sees his brothers when they come down to Egypt, and he recognizes them. Vayitnaker alehem, and he acted strangely towards them, or he acted like a stranger. Vayidaber itam kashot, and spoke harshly to them. Vayomer el, and he accuses them of being spies. And then the Torah says again in Pasuk Chet, Vayaker Yosef et echav vehem lo hikiru. Yosef recognized his brothers, and they did not recognize him. The first question that immediately strikes you when looking at these two verses is, why does the Torah say twice that Yosef recognized his brothers? Vayakirem, Vayar Yosef et echav vayakirem. Yosef sees his brothers and recognizes them. And then in the second pasuk, it says also, Vayaker Yosef et echav, Yosef recognized his brothers. Why does the Torah have to state that twice? The second question is, which is what a lot of the commentaries deal with, is why didn't they recognize Yosef? Why didn't they recognize him? I mean, this is their brother, for goodness sake. It's 20 years, 20 years. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so he grew up. It's certainly possible, you know, the way they portray the ancient Egyptians in Hollywood is they've got the eyeshadow and okay. So there's the two conventional opinions. Rashi is vehem lo hikiruhu sheyatsa me'etzlam b'lo chatimat zakan ve'achshav ba b'chatimat zakan. Rashi tells us that he hadn't reached physical maturity. He hadn't reached puberty when they sold him into a slave, or at least not full puberty. He was 17 years old. So he was clean shaven when they sold him, and now he's got a beard, which is a little bit weird when you think about it. All the pictures that we see in the hieroglyphics of Egyptians is that they're not bearded, or at least some of them are not bearded. Some of them are bearded and some of them are not. So maybe he had a beard. Maybe that could be the thing that camouflaged his appearance. Rashi then tells us, Midrash Agada, Vayaker Yosef et achav, kishenimtzeru biyado hikir shehem echav v'richem aleihem. That when it says that Yosef recognized his brothers, it means that he treated them like brothers, meaning that he had compassion for him. He now had the opportunity to do with them as he wished. He had the upper hand. And yet, because he recognized them as his brothers, he chose, nonetheless, to be compassionate. Vehem lo hikiruhu kishenafal biyadam linhog bo achava. But when the tables were turned previously, when they were in control, they did not recognize him as their brother. And this is basically the Torah telling us in the second pasuk, and Rashi is clearly cognizant of this question, like why does the Torah say Yosef recognized them twice, is to basically point out to us it's not just physical recognition, but it's like the way I recognize you is not just my saying that I know who you are, but when I recognize you in the room is when you raise your hand, I recognize you, right? And it's sort of like basically saying, I treat you in a certain way by recognizing you. Yosef recognized his brothers as brothers. And when the 20 years prior, when he had the upper hand, they did not recognize him. They did not acknowledge him.
If that verb is used over and over.
Very good. Yeah.
It's not my finished, that forming on it, and he shows how it's all intertwined and it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Right. Hakerna. Recognize this ketonet. And then Vayakira Vayomer. And Yaakov recognizes it, right? So recognition plays very large. The Ram. Precisely. The Ramban says that it's unlikely that Yosef would have recognized, based on what Rashi says, Yosef probably would have not recognized the younger brothers if so much time had elapsed. He says, V'hinei Yisachar Zvulun einam gedolim mi Yosef rak ma'at. Leah's youngest sons, Yisachar and Zvulun, were only slightly older than Yosef. And if so much time elapsed that Yosef's physical appearance changed, then Yisachar and Zvulun also probably physically changed. Aval kevan shehikirat agdolim hikirat kulam. So, but basically what, to sort of support Rashi, the Ramban says, Yosef recognized his older brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. They hadn't changed because they were already bearded men when they sold Yosef into slavery, and they hadn't changed their appearance significantly, maybe a few gray hairs, right? So therefore, he was able to sort of extrapolate that the other young men that were with Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda were also his brothers as well. And then the Ramban says, V'od hayam makiram mida'ato sheyavo usham. He says, another reason why Yosef recognized his brothers and they didn't recognize him, based on what Rachel was saying as well, is that Yosef anticipated that maybe one day I'll meet up with my brothers in Egypt. But vehem lo hikiru, shelo natnu libam sheyiyeh ha'eved asher machru la yishme'elim hu hashalit al haaretz. It never dawned on them that the younger brother that they sold into slavery would ever be the viceroy of Egypt. And what this is, the Ramban is providing us an insight that we all probably know to be true. You ever do a double take and not recognize someone because they're completely out of context of where you expect to see them, right? So you go, you know your rabbi, right? But you go to the Bahamas and you see the rabbi in Bermuda shorts and a flowered shirt and wearing sunglasses and sipping a pina colada on the beach. So you might not just walk right past him. Hopefully walk right past him. And it wouldn't even dawn on you that your rabbi would be in the Bahamas. Yeah, exactly, right. So the Ramban says that it's based on context. They never entertained the possibility that they would ever see Yosef again. So their minds were playing tricks on them. This is just Yosef. It doesn't even enter into the cheshbon, right? So I want to share with you an idea from the Imre Emes first, one of the more recent Ger Rebbes, and he says as follows. At the beginning of our parsha, we have Paro's dream, and in Paro's dream, that there were 7 good cows, 7 healthy, robust cows coming out of the Nile. You know the story, right? The Torah mentions 3 positive attributes about these 7 cows. And if you look carefully at the psukim, is Yefot Mar'eh, they were visually, aesthetically pleasing. Uvriot Basar, they were of healthy flesh. In other words, you could tell that they were healthy animals. Vatir'ena ba'achu, and they were grazing in the swamp. That's the image that Paro has about these 7 cows. Now, when we look at the contrast to the 7 unhealthy cows, it says that how do we describe them? Ra'ot mar'eh vidakot basar. They were of bad visual appearance. They looked very ugly, and they had very unhealthy bodies, unhealthy flesh. What about the fact that it doesn't talk about where they were grazing? It doesn't say, and they were on, let's say, dry land or anything like that. In other words, you would have expected that the third characteristic of a positive image in the dream would have been contrasted with the 7 bad cows. But only the first 2 attributes are contrasted, and the third attribute of the animals grazing healthily in the swamp is not mentioned at all. It should have said, and they were standing there on sand or something like that, where they wouldn't be able to graze, but it doesn't say that. So the question is, why not? So this is something that the Imre Emes engages in, and he quotes the Chidushe Harim, which I think is his grandfather, great-grandfather. Omar al Inyan Zayin Haparot Tovot V'Haraot. He says, my Zayda, the Chidushe Harim, when he wanted to comment on this dream of the good cows versus the bad cows, Shekesheba'a Kedusha Yored Achareha Tekef Hester. That first of all, this is a pattern that we see in the world in general, that when something very holy comes into the world, it is quite common for there to be Hester immediately afterwards, right? This has to do with God creating equilibrium in the world. When there is a creation or a manifestation of something very, very spiritually strong, there needs also to be some kind of contrasting dampering of holiness in some other realm or some other area, in order to be able to allow mankind to always maintain equilibrium. Because if there's too much light, then man loses free will. The whole function of creation is defeated. The whole purpose is defeated. So for every brightness of holiness that comes into the world, it needs to be followed by some kind of dampering or diminution of that holiness as well. So that's on one level what Paro's dream represents. The 7 robust cows is followed by the 7 bad and unhealthy cows, because that's the way the world works in general. And then he says, Uve parot hatovot hayu gimel midot yafot mar'eh uvriut basar vatir'ena ba'achu. He says, notice that with the good cows, there were 3 good attributes. They were visually attractive, they were healthy, and they were grazing in the swamp. Uve parot haraot shekenegdan hayu rak bet midot raot. And with the bad cows, there are only 2 contrasting attributes, which are ra'ot or mar'eh v'dakut basar, poor aesthetic quality and unhealthy. Exactly. That's the point, is that there is no difference as to where they're standing in the dreams. Why? The bad cows. The bad cows are standing right next to the good cows. But if you were looking for complete contrast, instead of saying that the good cows were grazing in the swamp, say that the bad cows were standing on dry sand or something like where there was no produce for them, no vegetation for them to graze. Okay? Kineged vatirena ba'achu ein shum hester. So now it's based on Chassidus now, okay? The word ba'achu in the swamp, the word achu, it's not a very common word. But what word sounds like achu? Achava, right? Or echav, right? Brotherhood. That they were grazing in, not in the swamp, but they were grazing in brotherhood. Okay? He says, when it comes to brotherhood, there is no privation. Ki Yisrael heim ba'achdut echat, v'chol echad yesh lo ayin tova lachavero, ein shum hester, ve'ein midat hadin sholetet bahem. He says, because when the Jewish people are united, then, and everyone is looking at the other favorably, then there is no hester. There can be no privation. There can be no sort of loss of that achdus. You might lose out on visual appearance, you might lose out on healthiness, but you will never lose out on that sense of unity that the Jewish people share. Ve'ein midat hadin sholetet bahen. And there therefore can be no loss, right? So therefore, even though these 7 cows represent a sort of a recalibration after an explosion of holiness, there has to be a corresponding sort of manifestation of the lack of that, privation of holiness. But since the first 7 cows represented unity in their grazing together, there can be no privation of that, even though God seeks equilibrium. That's the reason Al Pi Chassidus, using Chassidus, the word ba'achu referring to unity and achva and brotherhood, that's the reason why there's no corresponding privation when describing the bad cows. Now, what does this have to do with our discussion? He says, V'chein ita b'zohar Kuzari+Parshas zu, shahakol talui ba'ayin tova. He says, the Zohar also says that it all depends on a good eye. Good eye, contrasted with ayin hara. When we say ayin hara, like kanayin hara, ayin hara means that a person looks with contempt upon someone else's situation. But ayin tov is when a person feels a sense of unity and a sense of kinship and benevolence and generosity to someone else's situation. He says that's the world is dependent upon every person looking kindly upon the other. Al yedei zeh mitbatalim hadinim. And if that can happen, then all negative decrees are annulled. And of the Adoni Zal Omar ala Pasuk, and accordingly, my father stated about the following pasuk in Mishlei: Nefesh Rosha Otara Lo Yuchan Be'inam Re'ehu. He says, the soul of the wicked person, Otara Lo Yuchan Be'inav Re'ehu. That I think what it means is that evil that is within him he will not be able, I'm not sure if it's Ra or Re, I should have looked up the pasuk. Lo yuchan be'inav re'ehu, his friend will not be looked kindly upon by him. She'im eno ra'a b'shel chaveiro, zehu siman shahanefesh mikulkelet. That if a person looks unkindly upon another, that's a sign that a person's soul is corrupted in some way. When you look at another person's situation and you looked at it with contempt, critically, and that's a sign that there's something wrong with you. This is a statement that our sages tell us, kol ha-posel, v'mumo posel. And when you disqualify another, when you find fault or a blemish in somebody else, that you're really just focusing on that which exists within yourself and projecting it upon somebody else. Uve'emet sarich liyot lehefech le'echoz atzmam biyachad. But in reality, Instead of looking at someone else askance or with criticism, you're supposed to feel a sense of kinship with that other person, associate in some way with that person. But he says, "V'zeh haperush b'med dichtiv vayaker Yosef et echav." That, now we get to the punchline. This, says the Imrei Emes, is really what the pasuk means when it says that Yosef recognized his brothers. Hainu shahayat tov ayin aleihem. That means that he looked at them with a positive gaze. In other words, after all those years, Yosef could have looked at his brothers with contempt. He had every right to look at them with contempt. But after all these years, he chose to use an ayin tov. Shezeh perush yefei toar v'fei mar'eh. And that's what it means when it describes Yosef as being of a good appearance and a good look. It doesn't mean that when you looked at Yosef, you were attracted to him. That may be Yefei Toar. But what is Yefei Mar'eh, according to the Imrei Emes? It means that he had a good look looking outward. He had a good look. Is that when he looked at others, he would look at others kindly. That's what it means. And it is only because of Yosef's positive look at his brothers that all of the other judgments against them were removed and they were granted a reprieve. Because he was able to overlook their trespass against him, they were able to be granted a reprieve. Now, I want to build on this idea of Yosef, Vayaker Yosef et Achav, does not mean that he recognized them physically. It doesn't mean, but it rather means, like what Rashi had told us in the second interpretation, that he chose to acknowledge them as his brothers. And why is that? Because Yosef had this ability to look at others in a positive light. And sort of years have gone by. I'm sure that when I was 17 years old, he's thinking to himself, I probably came across as a bit arrogant in their eyes. I'm sure that I provoked them. I'm sure that they probably feel remorse over what they have done. So let me look at them charitably. And by looking at them charitably, he was able to get past what they had done to him and was able to grant them even a heavenly reprieve. Yeah.
Says later on that this is all Krishna's plan. So he recognized
Exactly. And I'm going to go even further than that, although I like what you're saying, Rachel, is that he was able to come to the realization that this is part of a divine plan. I think it's even more than that. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. Why Yosef was able to reach this madrega of looking at his brothers charitably, I want to show you something else that is related to what Yosef, the way Yosef looked at his brothers when he was younger, changed after he was sent down to Egypt. Okay, now, Vehem lohi kiruhu is the most tragic statement. His brothers didn't recognize him. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute. What I would like to suggest is that one of the primary reasons that Yosef was able to look at his brothers in a more charitable way than he had previously done is because he went to Egypt. Now, when you look at the beginning of last week's Parshas Vayeshev, it says that Vayave Yosef et dibatam ra'a el abihem. Yosef was critical of his brothers even before he was sold to slavery. He used to bring their bad tidings to their father, right? You know that story. That's how he got into trouble in the first place, right? Rashi tells us that there were three things that Yosef would observe his brothers doing. Shahayu ochlim ever min achai. He would tell his father, Father, I've seen my brothers eating from a live animal. They were deprecating to their brothers from Bilhah and Zilpah, calling them slaves, calling them servants. In other words, not showing proper derech eretz to their own family. And v'chashudim al ha'arayot, and they were suspect of doing licentious acts with other women. Now, The Mizrahi has a very lengthy commentary on this Rashi to explain specifically why Yosef accused his brothers of these three things, which is really Rashi quoting from the Midrash. They didn't really eat Aver Mordechai, but they would slaughter an animal and not wait until it was completely stopped kicking. And halachically, you're allowed to eat from a freshly shechted animal, even though its nerves are still firing, right? Its nervous system is still firing, but the animal is halachically permitted for eating. They did not in any way mean to deprecate their brothers by calling them, they called them B'nei Hashpachos, the sons of the servants, only to identify them, but not in any way to deprecate them. They were involved in the world of trade. And so it was necessary for them to schmeichel and to schmooze with women that they would meet from other cultures, but that doesn't mean that they were engaged in anything licentious, right? So Yosef, however, took this negative view of his brothers. What I would like to suggest is that going down to Egypt, Yosef was shown real depravity in these three areas. And it was his ability to see in a foreign culture the evil that was. Would you mind taking that out of? Okay, thank you. Thank you. What Yosef was able to arrive at was at an understanding that, as bad as I thought my brothers were, my introduction to a foreign culture has awoken me to the fact that what I thought was bad is nothing compared to what I've seen in Egypt. And it's in these three specific areas. Now, Rashi, I've only quoted you a snippet of Rashi. Rashi says that Yosef was punished in these three areas, that, especially with Eshet Potiphar, or that he was called a slave, and so forth. But what Yosef is witness to in Egypt, we know that the Torah tells us that Egyptian behavior, when it comes to eating all kinds of vermin, is, it says in Parshas Kedoshim, after telling us all of or Parshas Shemini rather, after telling us all of the forbidden creatures that we're not allowed to eat, the things that swarm the earth, the reptiles and the creeping creatures, it says, Ki ani Hashem ama'aleh etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am Hashem who has elevated you out of Egypt, where it was the common practice to eat all manner of creeping animal, eating them alive, like that scene from, what was the old movie where they sit around a table and they're fed monkey brains from a monkey who's had Indiana Jones, I think it was, one of the Indiana Jones movies, where in Africa they go and they're served like this delicacy where they take these dead monkeys and they just lop off their skulls and they spoon out the brain, right? What? Or if they were even dead. Yeah. But the point is that when you go to Egypt and you see really that kind of exploitation opportunity to be exposed to other cultures, then we might not be as critical of our own when we see that things are actually much better among Unzura than we had thought. It's a good thing because humans are humans, and you have to be a little bit more charitable with the way that you view things. In other words, I'll give you an example when it comes to food. Right? You see people in our community eating gribbinus and kishka and all these things that are unhealthy. You go to a kiddush sometimes and everything is brown or gray. There's not a leaf to be found. Okay. And so you may look upon that with some perhaps a critical view, right? And you would be correct to do so because we should be eating healthy. right? But then you look at the real, then you look at some other culture, which may have an even more unhealthy way of eating. And it sort of realigns your perspective to help you appreciate the fact that I guess we're not as bad off as I thought we were. Or perhaps maybe people you feel may not be addressing each other in the way that they should. But then you look, you go outside and you go on social media and you see how people are abusive of each other. And you see, you know what, I'll stick to my own kehillah. Or you see that people may be acting perhaps in a way that may be immodest, but compared with what's out there, look, we are all a product of our environment. And so we are an imperfect people. The Jewish people have a lot of improvement. There's plenty of room for improvement among our own family, among our own tribe. The point I'm making is that what allowed Yosef to be able to see beyond the negative was when he was exposed to all of this in Egyptian society, is tempted by Potiphar's wife, sees the way the Egyptians live, sees how there is a true caste system, right, in Egypt, where certain people are exploited, far worse than Yosef's brothers ever exploited the other brothers, Gad and Asher and Naphtali and so forth, right? So then Yosef is able to put things in perspective and say, you know, yes, it's true, my brothers were wrong, but I realize that the values that we had as a family far surpass any of the values that I found when I came down to Egypt. Now, how do I want to put this in perspective for Hanukkah? I actually found this today from in a sefer called Divrei Ish. It turns out that Rabbi Avraham Yeshaya Dolgan, or Rabbi Simon Dolgan, was the rabbi of my old shul where I was bar mitzvah, but he left just as we had moved to California back in the early 70s. And he wrote a sefer at some point later after he had left the pulpit. And he quotes a statement of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which I haven't been able to find in the original writings. He says, "V'hadlakat nerot Chanukah anu noagim kishitat Beit Hillel." When we light Hanukkah candles, we go like Beis Hillel. Uv'chol yom mosifim umadlikim ner nosaf shelo hudlak b'yom hakodem. And we add on a new candle every night. So last night we added one to the candle that we had lit previously on the first night. Rabbi Nachman mi Breslov he'ir she'omnam anachnu madlikim b'chol yom ner nosaf. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said that notice that we always add a candle to the previous one. Ulam ba'ota sha'a anachnu madlikim gam kein et hanerot hakodmim. But we also light the nights that we previously experienced also. It's not that we light a new candle and put it in the spot for night 2, but we light candle 1 and candle 2. And then tonight we're going to light candle 3 plus candle 2 and candle 1. Kolomar, ein anu osim ka'otam anashim shemavakshim lahadlik or chadash. We're not like those people who only want to light a new candle. Ulam heim svurim shebichdei lahadlik chadash yesh tzorech lechabot et hayashan. So some people think that in order for a new age to dawn, you have to extinguish the past. One of our greatest assets is that we have a history. One of the greatest assets that the Jewish people have is that we can look both forward and backward. I'll speak about this on Shabbos when I speak about our trip to the UAE. But the point being is that we don't extinguish the candles from the previous nights. We add to them and continue lighting them. Zohi gamma alato shel Yosef HaTzadik. This was Yosef's ability. As it says, B'sha'a shenaflu biyado vayaker Yosef et echav. B'sha'a shenafal biyadam vehem lo hikiru. When Yosef was able to meet up with his brothers, it wasn't just, he said, I'm starting anew and I'm forgetting about the fact that we were brothers from the same family. I will not forget that we were brought up as brothers. I will remember my brothers and the fact that we are kin, but I will create a new light and a new reality based on the new circumstances of today, but at the same time holding on to the past, holding on to the positive aspects of the past and building upon that. The brothers were prepared to completely write Yosef off, never remembering the fact that he was their brother. And that's the way you can look at this pasuk as well. Mitzvah aleinu, I'm just skipping a few lines. It says, Mitzvah aleinu lahadlik nerot chadashim sheya'iru et ha'atid. We have a mitzvah to always light new candles all the time in Judaism, to build on the past. Ulam yesh la'asot zot al yesodot hanerot hakodmim. It always has to be based on the old candles of yesterday. Al or haTorah shel kol hadorot she'apru. To build upon the light of Torah of the previous generations. Az nizkeh limenorah mele'ah v'lo or chadash al tzion. That's how we'll be able to have a complete menorah and to have a new light shining on Zion. That's the key, to always build on the past, not to jettison it completely. That's the connection that I wanted to bring to Hanukkah from Rabbi Nachman and how Rabbi Dolgin develops that and connects it to Yosef. Yosef recognizes that we can't just jettison the past. We have to attach ourselves to our fellow brothers and sisters, attach ourselves to our history, but at the same time, keep moving forward. Yes. Yes. Why did Yosef not get in touch with his father? That's a question that many of the commentaries ask. So what did Rabbi Sachs answer? To meet his brothers. It's an interesting answer. You're quoting Rabbi Sachs as saying is that maybe Yosef bore some resentment towards his father for having sent him out to see his brothers. Yeah. Thought his father may be against him, perhaps. Yes.
Even at the time I was so very young when I arrived in a foreign country, I could not be in touch with my parents. I mean, I couldn't tell them everything that was happening. But then reality, if I would have seen reality the way it really was, I wouldn't have existed. But the point is that from my point of view, looking back in time, how
could you not reach out to your parents?
No matter what.
The most for me, what makes the most sense is that Yosef understood that the dreams that he had as a young man were prophecies. And he also understood that the only way that these prophecies could be fulfilled is if he allowed Hashem to cause things to unfold in the way that they did. And they would never have unfolded had he revealed to his father that he was alive. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with that. Yeah. Okay, we're going to hold it here for today. Let me wish you all a happy Hanukkah. Thanks all for joining us online. Take care now.